We are carrying on looking at Abraham's life. We're kind of getting on towards the end of Abraham's life, actually, in Genesis chapter 23. Actually, Genesis chapter 22 initially. We will finish off Genesis chapter 22. Last time in Genesis chapter 22, we looked at how Abraham was tested and how even though he didn't understand, he obeyed. It's a very good principle. You know, if God asks you to do something, number one, check and confirm that it is God who is asking. Abraham, by this stage, we saw how he was familiar with God's voice and he understood. He had clarity when God asked him to do something, that it was God who was speaking. But once we are clear, if we know that God is asking us to do something, just to do it, not question, not to have too many. You know, sometimes we as human beings like to understand something, especially in the West, those who've been brought up with a Western mindset where the mind is everything. We can sometimes have this thing that I have to understand before I do something. Well, Abraham obeyed before he understood. He didn't fully understand. He was asked to take his son and to put him on an altar in the region of Moriah to sacrifice him to God. And that willingness that Abraham showed was a very precious thing to God, that God saw the willingness in Abraham's heart to do what he was asked faithfully without necessarily questioning it. I'm sure God knew that that was there within Abraham to do it, but it was more like, as often is the case with tests, when God tests us, he doesn't do it so much for him to know what's going on, because he knows everything. He does it very often for us to see it ourselves, and also for other people to see and understand, so that now when we can see hundreds, thousands of years later, millennia later, God being faithful to the Israelite nation, we can look back to that moment and say, actually, well, God did promise them a land and descendants because Abraham was faithful. So it almost becomes a declaration, not just, the test is not just going on between Abraham and God, as it were, and it's not just between the two of them, but actually becomes a declaration that this is what is in the substance of a person. This is what is within that person. And so as people see the interaction between God and that person and their descendants years later, they can acknowledge and look back and say, actually, the faithfulness of that person won an amazing thing. Anyhow, we finish off Genesis chapter 22 with just 4 verses towards the end, which prepare us really for Isaac's life. They are an understanding into the goings on that were going on. Remember, Abraham left his family in the land of Ur, in the land of the Chaldeans, would have been called probably by the time a lot of this was being written, the land of the Babylonians. Abraham left all his family behind, and then we followed Abraham and his story. But here, in these 4 verses of the end of chapter 22, we are quickly taken back to the family of Abraham that was left behind, as it were, in the land of Uz, or Ur, I believe it was. This is what it is. Sometime later, we are told, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor. Milcah was Nahor's wife, and she bore him some sons. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother, and Kemuel, who became the father of Aram. Interestingly, that's where the Syrians come from. That's why if you talk to some Syrians, they count themselves as cousins of the Israelites to a certain extent. So the Arameans, or the Arameans, you will come across them time and time again in the Bible. For example, when Naaman, the prince or commander in the army of the Aramean king, was healed of leprosy, he would have been a descendant of what would have been Abraham's brother. Basically, Abraham's brother had a wife called Milcah. Milcah became a mother, and she got three sons. We are told she had sons to Nahor. The first one was called Uz, the second one was called Buz, and the third one was called Kemuel, who became the father of Aram. Aram then became the father of the Arameans, and they effectively became what are the modern day Syrians today. And so the brothers carry on, it doesn't stop there. There was Kesed as well, and then Hazor, and Pildash, and Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And then we're given a rather fascinating insight here. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Rebekah, as we know, later on would end up becoming Isaac's wife. So Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor. And then his concubine, whose name was Reumah, this is Nahor's concubine, also had sons. She had Teba, and Gaham, and Tahash, and Maacah. So Nahor ended up having quite a few children. So you can imagine he too increased considerably, and his descendants became many. So in verse 23, we are introduced to Bethuel. Bethuel is somebody who we'll get to find out a little bit more in Genesis chapter 24, the father of Rebekah. And he was quite a character, quite an interesting character. If you want, you can go ahead and read ahead in Genesis chapter 24 about this man Bethuel, who ended up becoming dad to Rebekah, who ended up becoming Isaac's wife. But what we are told so far basically is that Bethuel was one of Abraham's brother's sons. In other words, Bethuel was nephew to Abraham. So Bethuel's daughter ended up marrying Abraham's son, if that kind of makes sense. Bethuel was Abraham's brother's son, and then Bethuel's daughter ended up marrying Abraham's son.
They're not direct cousins, are they?
No, they're not quite direct cousins. They're kind of cousins once removed. There's a little bit of a step there. Bethuel actually would have been Isaac's cousin.
Yeah.
Have I got that right? Yes. Because Abraham bore Isaac and Ishmael. And you have Nahor here, who would have been Isaac's uncle, bore Bethuel, amongst other sons. So Isaac and Bethuel would have been cousins. And Bethuel's daughter, Rebekah, ended up becoming Isaac's wife. That's helpful to have that context, because it gives a little bit of an understanding when you come to read Genesis chapter 24 later on, as to all the goings on there. Anyhow, let's carry on into Genesis chapter 23, and here we read about the death of Sarah. By this time, Sarah would have been very special to Abraham. They would have been very close. They would have been, just as you would naturally expect when two people have lived together for so long.
She was so special.
She was so special. When two people have lived together for so long, it's a little bit like in the United Kingdom, in April of 2021, Prince Philip died, and he had been married to the Queen for a very, very long time. Since, I think it was 1952, they had their wedding. I can't remember. No, 1952 was when she ascended to the throne, so I think it was before that. So they'd been together over 60 years, something like that, their marriage, rather. And so during that amount of time, when you've been with somebody that length of time, it is inevitable. You become almost like, you become one unit. It should be one unit from the beginning. Yes, you become one unit from the beginning, true, but you kind of grow into that union. Initially, there is an initial time when there is a growing into that union, from the beginning. But by the time you're sort of 60, 70 years down the road, there is a kind of a closeness of a bond. Anyway, let's read about it in Genesis chapter 23. This is what it says. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here, so that I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, Listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. So Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by Hittites as a burial site. A lot that we can learn, really. Firstly, it's worth saying that, to put this in time context, Sarah dies when she's 127 years. So we are talking probably 20 plus years since the previous chapter when Abraham was asked to go and offer Isaac on the altar at Moriah. So we are seeing it's about 20 or so years from that time when Abraham was tested. So it's a bit of time has lapsed. But we are seeing, in addition to that, there's something like 35 years since we last saw Sarah, actually, in the scripture, when she insisted that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away from the house. Remember that party that Abraham threw up, a weaning party, when Isaac was just being taken off that mother's milk when he was being weaned. And they threw a party and they had all these kings. And then we see Ishmael mocking. And there we see in that whole process, as Ishmael is mocking, Sarah gets very cross and she says, this boy has to be taken out of this house. There is no way he's going to share an inheritance with my son. And that's the last time really we hear of both Sarah and Hagar, interestingly. Well, we kind of hear of Hagar a little bit later on in terms of how she ends up in the wilderness, but that's the last we hear of Sarah until now when she dies. So 35 years passed since then. So we're talking a considerable amount of time between then. So Isaac himself would have been around 37 years old by the time Sarah dies. So Isaac would have grown up, would have had enough time to have established a bond between himself and his mum, all that amount of time. Ishmael would have been some 12 or so years, so we're talking probably 45, 49, coming up to 50 years by the time Sarah had actually died. So they'd been living there for quite a while. We are told that they lived in Mamre, which was then called Kiriath Arba, which is, by the time Moses was writing this, called Hebron. And it's about some 20 or so miles south of Jerusalem, fairly central in the land, in the promised land. And that was where they'd found themselves. In fact, that's the first place when Abraham went into the promised land. He found himself there by the trees of Mamre in Hebron. And that's the first place he actually built an altar. So this place had actually a huge significance. It was where Abraham laid claim to the land. And so we then read here of this transaction that goes on between Abraham and the Hittites. Abraham arose from his bed beside the dead wife and he spoke to the Hittites. Incidentally, this is not the only culture where I've heard this, where when people die, sometimes close relatives or even close family will go and be with the deceased for a certain amount of time, maybe even in their room, where they are processing their grief, where they are saying goodbye to the person who has departed. Anyway, Abraham clearly did this for a little bit of a while. And then there came a time when he decided, right, she needs to be buried. So he then rose up and he got up and he thought to himself, we need to bury Sarah. We need to find somewhere to bury her. And we are told he went to the Hittites who owned the land that they were living in at that time, the land near Kiriath Arba, where they found themselves in Hebron. He went to them, to the Hittites, the people there, and he said to them, look, he approached them as a foreigner, as a stranger amongst them. Remember, God had said to him repeatedly that he would give him the land. But in humility, Abraham goes and approaches the people who owned the land at that time as a stranger in that land. Incidentally, there's a lot to be gleaned from this. You know, when God promises you something, sometimes there's a wisdom, because sometimes God can promise you something, and then there is a gap of time between him promising you that thing and you actually taking hold of it. And there is a wisdom in terms of how you behave during that interim time when you do not actually own, you have not readily grasped what God has promised you. So for example, if God were to say to you, that is the man that I want you to marry, it would be very strange for you to just turn up to that person's house, knock on the door of their house and say, God has told me you're the man that I am supposed to marry. There is a rightness in appreciating the circumstances as they are then, and as the circumstances were there and then. Abraham was living as a foreigner and as a stranger in that land. So he approaches the Hittites and he says to them, look, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. And then he says to them, please sell me some property for a burial site here so that I can bury my dead. What then transpires is an insight into how transactions happened during those times, in those Middle Eastern kind of cultures. Now the Hittites were going to give Abraham the land. They did not have any qualms with giving Abraham the land that he was asking for. However, they were not about to give it to him for free. It might look like that's the case when you read initially that they say to him, sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. You can bury the dead in any of our choicest tombs. Any of them, you can bury the dead. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying the dead. However, they knew, they must have had insight that Abraham had a very particular preference. He had a very particular choice, which is why they began with this opening offer of saying, whatever you want, you can have it. So then Abraham then responds on his side by saying, actually, I want that very specific land. And so they say to him, please intercede for me. Please ask on my behalf. That's what that word intercede literally means. So Abraham bows before them and he says, intercede with Ephron, the son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron happened to be sitting there. So now the transaction begins to narrow down. Initially it was all the Hittites are involved, and now Abraham makes clear exactly what he wants. It's a little bit like some cultures have this, where there is a pre-wedding ceremony, and in that pre-wedding ceremony, representatives from the groom go to the bride's place and they say, well, we found somebody here that we have an interest in. And so things kind of start off speaking in vague terms, in kind of broad terms. And then once the conversation goes on, things then get a bit more specific, where they turn around and Abraham then comes out and actually says, actually, this is exactly what I want. And he says, please go and intercede with Ephron, the son of Zohar, in other words, that particular family, because they own that particular piece of land. Please say to them that that is the field that I am interested in, and please ask them to sell it to me for a full price. Now, Ephron happened to be sitting there amongst them. So he then replies to Abraham. Now the conversation becomes direct between the two families. And Ephron then says to Abraham, who was sitting there, no, my lord, listen to me. I am going to give you the field. I give it to you. The field, the cave in it, everything here in the presence of the people, I give it to you. Bury your own dead. Now, at this point, again, we see Abraham bows down. You would think in any kind of right mind, anybody would be like, yeah, I want that thing. It's been given to me for free. Let me take it. Hallelujah. I'm going to grab it and go off and bury my dead. But no, Abraham does something which is very wise, which is very, very, very wise. He says this, he bows down before the people of the land again. And he says to Ephron, and we're told in verse 12 very specifically, in their hearing. In other words, he wanted them to witness what he wanted to do. He says, listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so that I can bury my dead there. Now, Ephron at this point understands the way this conversation is going, so he is not surprised in a way that Abraham says he wants to pay for it, because there was wisdom in those days. By saying I want to pay for it would mean that the family could not come back later on and say, actually, this is ours. They cannot come back later on and say, this is ours. You stole it from us. You grabbed it from us. You took it from us. They cannot come back later on and say, hey, this is ours. By paying for it means you end up with a receipt. You end up with something that says, this belongs to me. When you pay for something, you have that rightful ownership, that rightful sense of acquisition. There is a moment when it changes hands, and that changing of hands is clearly dictated, it's clearly defined, rather, declared even to all those who are present. And as Ephron hears Abraham saying, I want to pay for this, Ephron would not have been surprised by this. He would have understood that this was where the conversation was going. In those days, that's where the conversation, that's how if you wanted to buy something in that culture, in fact, in some African cultures, it would kind of happen in the same sort of way, where initially you'd start in broad terms, and then it would narrow down, and then you'd get down to the field, and then the owner of the field would be brought forward, and the owner might say, oh, you can have the field for whatever you want. But then the people that are interested in the field would stand up and say, actually, no, we want to pay for that field. At that point, the owner would then come out and lay claim, or rather declare the price. He would say, this is how much the field is worth. And so we see here, Ephron decides to declare, the field is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Go, take the dead and bury your dead. In other words, Ephron at this point was saying still, even though the field is worth this amount, well, what is it between you and I? That's like change. That's like loose change between you and I. We can see that you're a great prince. In fact, they say that to him right at the very beginning. We can see that you're a great man. And so they say, well, Ephron says, well, what is that between you and I? Just take it for free. But we see Abraham insists, and he says, no, I will pay for it. And so we see in verse 16, Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. That 400 of shekels of silver is very difficult to get the actual value. What we do know in Exodus, when God was saying to the people of Israel, before he built the tabernacle, he said to Moses, he gave them a specific instruction, I want you to redeem all the male people from the Israelites, and each man shall be worth a shekel. So in other words, those 400 shekels of silver would have been a lot of money, basically worth, if you like, 400, the equivalent of 400 firstborns, if you like, within that sort of sphere of time. It would have been a lot of money. But we are told Abraham went on to weigh all that money out. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms, and he weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites. 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight that was current among the merchants. Two things were very important to Abraham at that point. Number one, that he pays for the land. Number two, that they witness that he has paid for the land. And so the field of Machpelah, we are told, changed ownership that day. From that day on, it no longer belonged to the Hittites, it belonged to Abraham and his descendants. Ephron, that field that he owned, he could no longer call his own. It belonged to somebody else. We are told that that field, both the field and the cave in it and the trees and all the borders of the field, were deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of the Hittites who came to that city. And afterward, Abraham buried his wife, Sarah, in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And so the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham, Moses kind of emphasizing this, by the Hittites as a burial site. Interestingly, you can go to Israel today and find still today the grave of Abraham. In fact, that would end up being where Abraham was buried himself. That would end up being where Isaac as well would be buried. That would end up being where I believe Jacob as well was buried. It ended up becoming a very significant, you can actually go to it today in modern day Israel, or you can Google it on the internet and see the same place. That's right, Jacob and Leah as well were buried there. I remember Leah actually, yes. Leah was buried there. They ended up being buried there. The tomb, Isaac's tomb, Abraham's tomb, you can actually go and visit them today. Abraham's tomb, Jacob's tomb, and Leah as well. Rachel was slightly different. Rachel was buried somewhere as they were on their way. But yes, this became an important moment in Israel's history. To us, it might just look like Abraham purchasing a piece of land. Abraham understood that by having him and his descendants buried there, he was effectively saying this land is ours. He was laying claim to it. He was putting a stake in the ground, which is why he was keen to pay for it and to make sure there was a receipt that was clearly seen by everybody that he had paid for it. What Abraham was doing was he was laying claim to it not just for him, but for his descendants. He was saying this is where our people will be buried, and this is where we will call home. This is where we will call home. He was making a claim, a stake in the ground, saying, this is our land. This is why we read in Joshua chapter 14, really fascinatingly, that when the children of Israel came into the promised land and Joshua was parceling out bits of land, saying this person shall have this tribe shall have this, this particular group shall have this. When it came to Hebron, there wasn't a lot of people who were vying for Hebron. Why? Because in Hebron, interestingly enough, the Anakim were there, the giants were there. In other words, that was the one place where the enemy established a very strong stronghold that was there particularly to stop the children of Israel from laying claim to that land. In fact, we read in Numbers 13, when they went to spy out the land, when they came to Hebron, they saw these giants, and that was the one place that made them really, really afraid, and they came back running. All those spies, 10 spies, came back to the Israelites saying, no way we can take this land, there's all these giants in it. Where was it that they went to? Hebron. And that was the one place where they saw these giants. But what we read, rather fascinatingly, that was the one place Caleb, remember Caleb was one of the 12 spies, but he decided he was not going to go down the same route. Both Caleb and Joshua wanted to go down the same route of the other 10 spies. He believed that if God was with me, even if there are giants there, we can still lay claim to that land. We see in verse 6, the children of Judah, they came to Joshua in Gilgal, and then Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, you know the word which the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. But I wholly followed the Lord my God. So Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And then Caleb goes on to say, And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke his word to Moses, while Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, here I am this day, 85 years old. As yet I am as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was then, so now is my strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. Now, therefore, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim, the giants, were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, as his inheritance. Hebron, therefore, became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. And the name of Hebron, that was formerly called Kiriath Arba, because Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. My message for us today is very short, it's very simple, really. The thing which is most prized by God is where the enemy will establish his strongholds. If you find, even in your own life, that there is something that you're really wrestling with, there is something that you are really battling with, it could just be that that stronghold is an indication that God has laid a claim on that particular piece of land. It could be that the enemy has laid a claim on that particular thing. It could be your marriage, it could be your family, it could be your work situation, whatever it is, where you're finding there is such a stronghold. Maybe that there are giants there, maybe that there are strongholds, there are fortified cities, we are told. It could be that the reason that those things are there is because they have particular significance in God's purpose, in his will. And what he is looking for is for a heart like Caleb. He is looking for us, for a heart that looks beyond the giants, for a heart that looks beyond the fortified cities, to think, hang on, this is the land that Abraham purchased. This is the land that Abraham has a receipt for, and therefore his descendants have a receipt for it, and it belongs to us. This is the stake in the ground that says this land belongs to us. The question is, are you going to be a Caleb and look beyond the giants and say, I am going to take this in prayer and I am going to do something about it? Or are you going to be defeatist? And are you going to say, do you know what, these giants are too big, like the other 10 spies did, and they decided, no, the land is too difficult for us to get hold of. Abraham approached those Hittites as a foreigner. He would have seemed as an underdog. Seemingly, in that situation, when he came to those Hittites, he looked like he was the weaker. But he knew that God was with him. And he knew that God is the God of the impossible. He had seen in his own life impossible things becoming possible. Consequently, he was purposeful when he came to lay stake to that piece of property, because he knew what was really at stake. This was God acting, not just Abraham acting on his own. This was God acting on his behalf, saying, this is the land that we will call home. The enemy knew the significance of this as well. And that's why the enemy said, we will not permit this to go on. That's why, of all the strongest people in the land, they went for that piece of land in Hebron. And what we see here is that it took somebody like Caleb. It took somebody with Caleb's understanding who was able to see what was really at stake. Are you and I going to have the same heart as Caleb? Or are we just going to have our eyes fixed on the difficulties, on the strongholds, on the giants, as it were? Are we going to look beyond them and think, the whole reason the enemy is mucking about is because God wants to do something amazing? And are we going to therefore stand up and say, no, we will not permit this to go on? We live in times, particularly here in the West, where people like to get things for free. Abraham insisted he had to buy that property. He wasn't going to get it for free. And I would say things are very often more valuable when they are not for free. I'll finish with these short 3 verses from Matthew chapter 13. This is what it says. The kingdom of heaven is, and this is what I want to suggest to you, if it is of your heart, if it is of your purpose, if it is of your desire to lay claim to the kingdom of God, you've got to be ready to fold up some sleeves and fight. It will not come for free. This is what it says in Matthew chapter 13, verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, he went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away, sold everything he had, and he bought it. Jesus taught us, seek first the kingdom of heaven. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Seek with every fiber of your being the kingdom of heaven, and then everything else will be added to you. Do not be like the heathen who are chasing this, chasing that, chasing this, chasing that. Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and everything else will be added. And here we are told the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. The man found it. Notice, the man could have put it in his pocket and walked off. But what did he do? Instead, in his joy, he sold all he had, and he bought that field. Like Abraham, he wanted a receipt. He wanted a receipt so that somebody could not come afterwards and say, that thing is mine. That thing is mine. Give back that which is mine. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for pearls. When he found one of great value, he didn't just snatch it away. Instead, he went, sold everything he had, and he went and bought it. Friends, if Jesus, seeing the value that we were to him, insisted that he had to buy us back, so that now his shed blood remains as a receipt in the heavens that we belong to him, how much more we ought to be ready to pay in a certain way, to be willing to give up something for that which God is freely giving to his people. It is worth saying, in a way, nothing is for free. Everything has been purchased. Everything has to be procured, has to be purchased. And nothing is for free. And actually, there's something about the rightful thing. Even if somebody had a house and they gave it to me, I don't know, it's something in me would still say, I want a receipt. Because if that person's descendants came afterwards and said, well, actually, they weren't in their right mind when they did that, or maybe their will, this or that or the other, something in me would feel, no, I want a receipt. I want it written down. Even if I pay just £1 for it, I want it written down. And so in the same way, sorry?
So obviously, it's not written down, it's not been given.
Yeah,
Just
exactly. If it's not been written down, it's nebulous. It's like, and it can be contested. But Abraham, realizing the value of what he was prepositioning, he was willing to pay all those 400 shekels because he recognized this was for generations and generations to come. Are you willing to pay the cost for something that will affect not just your life, but will affect generations and generations to come? It will alter the course of generations and generations to come. It will not just land on your head like a pancake. It will not just come and all you have to do is just sit and receive. I personally have a lot of problem with churches that say, oh, just receive it. Because nowhere in the Bible are we told that. The scriptures are very plain. Jesus himself taught it, saying that actually, unless somebody loses themselves for Christ's sake, they will not find themselves. Unless the seed falls into the ground and dies, it is of no value. And so, for each one of us, I want to suggest to you there is a cost. There is a cost to be paid. If you want to lay claim to your spiritual inheritance, not just for your sake, but for the sake of your children and your children's children, be ready to do some fighting. Be ready to have that Caleb-like spirit that says, I don't care that there are giants there, I don't care that there are whatever, there are fortresses there. That field is mine and my descendants. Amen.